Thank you, Anna, and welcome everyone. Uh, as I just went through, there was a use case that was centered on the patient registration. And here you can read the slide in front of you on the human trafficking and what it entails in terms of its use case. Next slide. So the first step, of course, is to delineate the lineage in the use case. So you can just take a moment and read through the flow of events here. As you can see, pick up the events for the patient, for the clinician involved in the flow of events, and the data categories of what those events relate to in so much as the data sources are concerned. Next slide. And once we understand the data categories, then we're able to identify which fire resources come to bear on those data categories, essentially. So you can see, if you will slide, some examples of that. And the ones that are key, of course, will be involved with the patient, the practitioner, the event that took place, what happens actually in the emergency room. So there's there's an encounter, there's a triage, and there's an episode of care. So those are the examples of the HL7 fire resources that come into play in this particular use case. Next slide. And one obvious, attempt to understand this in designing it would be to come up with a conceptual workflow model. And you can see that on the left, essentially. So that kind of identifies the who and the what and the when something's involved in the workflow itself. Then what one would do is one would translate the conceptual workflow into a business process using the OMG BPMN notation, which is a standard, meaning that then what is represented in that standard is actually computable. In other words, it can be read by a computer, by other tools, and it can actually be, let's say, we can refer to that as a composable business model, meaning that we can redesign and recompose and republish the business model, which gives us quite a bit of leverage in implementing particular workflows. Next slide. So in the tool itself, Visible Analyst, one would first typically begin by defining the planning statements. And as Anna mentioned earlier, these planning statements simply are a way to get your arms around the requirement, okay? And in doing so, you can delineate your requirements into planning statement types. For example, a goal would be a planning statement type, an objective would be a planning statement type, strategy would be another planning statement type. So it's somewhat hierarchical. It could be somewhat of a form of a taxonomy. The idea, again, is to make sure that you've essentially identified the requirements. You can include the requirements in your planning statement descriptions, links to any URLs that come to bear on that particular description would be included also. And in doing so, then you're able to link these planning statements to all the other objects and artifacts in the underlying repository. Next slide. So when you're able to identify the composable, if you will, composable business model, you then are able to represent that business model in BPMN, as you can see here. And at the same time, you're able to draw the relationship between any artifact or object in your business model back to any requirement that you had set up, whether it be a goal, an objective, or a strategy. And in fact, in this particular business model, you also have a reference to something called data objects. And a data object is essentially a place where the data is stored and comes into play at some sequence or some point in time in the overall workflow of the business model. And here you can see that there are 3 identified in this particular case, which I'm having a little difficulty reading, but I think, okay, the patient registration record, the initial triage record, and the green bomb survey results. So in identifying a potential victim of human trafficking or child sex trafficking, what would probably happen in the emergency setting is that there'd be initial triage done. There would be an encounter, of course, a record of the encounter of that individual in the emergency room. And depending upon what path the business process takes or the pathway takes you, there may also be included in that a survey. And the survey, typically it's used as a survey instrument, which some of you may be familiar with, called the green bomb survey. Next slide. Given the fact that there are these data objects in the flow of events, in the workflow, there's also the opportunity to, like we were able to link the planning statement to any particular object in the workflow or the business process, we are also able to link any data object to the actual entities that are referenced by that data object. And when we do this, what we're doing is we're actually referencing an entity as defined within the FHIR HL7 resources. So here we are able to come full circle and link the actual data collected in the business process to the representation of that in the FHIR HL7 specification. Next slide. And once that is achieved, then we actually can query the instance data. So we've moved from basically the conceptual data through the logical data, and here is a slide showing that we can directly relate some step in our business process to the data. So we can query that data and in real time understand what our next step is in the actual pathway. And just